There's something about the deep woods that stirs an ancient kind of fear, something primal, something instinctual. Maybe it's the way the trees stretch too high, blocking out the sky. Maybe it's the silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you're being watched. Or maybe it's because we know, deep down, that we are not alone out there. Welcome to Dark Hours of Day. Tonight, we bring you true horror stories of the wilderness, stories of campers, hikers, and hunters who ventured too far into the unknown and came back changed. From strange figures lurking in the fog to impossible creatures staring from the treetops, these encounters will make you think twice before stepping into the woods alone. If you enjoy these chilling tales, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new nightmare. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and whatever you do, don't look into the trees. I don't talk about this much. Not because I'm trying to hide something, but because it still doesn't sit right in my head. You ever have an experience that doesn't fit? Like, no matter how you try to rationalize it, it just doesn't make sense? This happened about 5 years ago, and to this day, I won't camp alone anymore. I used to love solo trips, nothing but me, my tent, and the quiet of the woods. But after what I saw that night, I'll never be alone in the wilderness again. It was late September, just before the weather turned too cold. I'd driven about 4 hours out to a secluded spot in the mountains of Arizona, a place I'd been a few times before. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing near an old fire road. No other hikers, no cars, nothing but trees and open sky. Perfect. I set up camp, made a small fire, and settled in for the evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest got that eerie, expectant silence. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the occasional crack of a twig somewhere in the darkness. I wasn't scared. I'd camped enough to know the woods could be quiet at night. But then I heard something. A coyote. At least that's what I thought at first. It started as a yipping sound, high-pitched, maybe 100 yards off. Nothing weird about that. Coyotes are everywhere out here. But then it changed. The yipping turned into a garbled, choking noise, like something was trying to mimic a coyote but didn't quite know how. The sound stuttered, like a broken record, repeating itself in the exact same pattern every few seconds. Yip, yip, choke. Yip, yip, choke. I turned off my flashlight and just sat there, listening. Then I heard movement, something big moving through the brush. Not fast, not trying to be quiet, just there. I grabbed my hunting knife. Not that it would do much against a bear or a mountain lion, but it made me feel better. I stood up and aimed my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the trees, and for a second, I thought I saw something. Eyes reflecting back at me, but they were too high off the ground for a coyote, too far apart for a deer. I called out just in case it was another person. Hello? Silence. Then, clear as day, something called back. Hello? Same tone, same inflection. Exactly how I said it. I froze. It wasn't an echo. It was a voice. My voice. Something was out there, repeating what I said, word for word. My stomach dropped. My hands went cold. Every instinct in my body screamed, leave. I backed toward my tent, keeping my flashlight pointed toward the trees. That's when I saw it, something stepping out from the tree line. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, thin, almost emaciated. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, like it wasn't meant to be there. But the worst part? It had a face. Not an animal's, not a human's. Something in between. It opened its mouth and a sound came out. Half coyote, half human. Warped. Wrong. It laughed, but the laugh was stilted, unnatural, like it was trying to copy something it had heard but didn't understand how to make it real. I don't remember grabbing my keys. I don't remember stuffing anything into my bag. The next thing I knew, I was in my truck, hands shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. My headlights washed over the clearing, and for just a second, I saw it standing there at the edge of the woods watching me. Then, as I peeled out onto the fire road, I heard it, clear as day, my voice. Hello? I didn't stop driving until I hit pavement. When I got home, I looked up everything I could. Skinwalkers, Wendigo, spirits that mimic human voices. Every story I found said the same thing. If you hear your own voice in the woods, run. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. But I do know this. It wasn't a coyote, and it wasn't alone. I've never told this story before. Not to my family, not to my friends, not even to my boyfriend Matt, who was there with me when it happened. We never talked about it. Not that night. Not on the long, silent drive home. Not in the days after. Because some things aren't meant to be talked about. This happened about 3 years ago near Mount Shasta in Northern California. If you've never heard the stories about that place, do yourself a favor and don't look them up. I wish I never had. It was supposed to be a simple day hike. Matt and I had been dating for almost a year, and he knew I loved hiking, so he planned a trip out to one of the more isolated trails, one that wound deep through the forest at the base of the mountain. Not a technical hike, just a long one, a little over 8 miles round trip. We started in the afternoon, moving slow, enjoying the scenery. The trees there are enormous, ancient. They tower over you, making you feel like a speck in some forgotten world. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. We lost track of time. The sun dipped lower than we expected, the shadows stretched longer across the trail, and we realized, we needed to move. We weren't in any real danger yet, but we hadn't brought gear for night hiking. No jackets, no food, just our water bottles and a couple of cheap flashlights in our backpacks. We weren't worried, though, not at first. We turned back, moving faster now, trying to make it to the parking lot before dark. But the darkness came faster than it should have. I swear, 1 second the sun was casting this orange glow through the trees, and the next, black. Just black. It wasn't normal. Even the twilight seemed off, like the shadows were creeping in from the wrong direction. I could feel it, this weird pressure in the air, like we'd walked into some invisible threshold and crossed over into somewhere else. Matt was just ahead of me on the trail when I heard it, a rustling way up high. I turned, thinking it was just the wind moving through the branches, but there was no wind. The trees were completely still. The sound was something else. Something moving. I slowed my pace. Did you hear that? Matt stopped, listened. Silence. Then, crack. Above us. Not a small branch breaking, a big one. Something heavy had shifted up there. Matt pulled out his flashlight, aiming it at the treetops. The beam barely cut through the darkness, but for a split second, I saw something. A shape. Not an animal, not a bird, a human shape. But it wasn't standing on a branch. It was clinging to the trunk of the tree like a lizard. And then it moved, not climbed, scrambled, upward, fast, too fast, limbs jerking in a way that didn't make sense. It didn't stop at the top of the tree. It swung itself across to the next one. I felt something cold slide down my spine. My breath hitched in my throat. Matt saw it too. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed my wrist, his fingers like iron, and started pulling me down the trail. The forest was too quiet now, wrongly quiet. No insects, no night birds, just the sound of our footsteps and the rustling above us. Because whatever was up there, it was following us. I could hear it, the scrape of claws on bark, the creak of branches bowing under something too heavy. But I didn't want to look, because I knew if I looked up, I would see it looking back. So I kept my eyes forward, my hand locked in Matt's, our pace quickening until we weren't walking anymore. We were running. The trail was a blur beneath my feet. I don't know how long we ran, maybe a minute, maybe 10. But every step they followed, not just one, many, more than 2, more than 3. I could hear them, above us, surrounding us, keeping pace. Matt suddenly yanked me hard to the side, and I nearly fell. We were off the trail. "Shortcut," he gasped. He didn't explain, just kept running. We plowed through underbrush, leaping over roots, branches whipping against my arms and face. My lungs burned. I could barely see, but I could hear them. They were excited now. Their movements had changed. No longer just following, they were circling. The forest opened up. A break in the trees, the parking lot. Our car sat at the far edge, looking so damn small under the sickly orange glow of the single street lamp. We sprinted toward it, the sound of branches snapping behind us. I couldn't help it. I looked, and I wish I hadn't, because I saw them, not clearly, not in the light, but in the dark between the trees. Silhouettes. Human, but not. Too long, too thin, their arms stretched too far, their fingers curled like claws, and their eyes, Jesus Christ, their eyes. They didn't glow, they didn't shine, they were just there, watching, grinning. We reached the car. Matt fumbled with the keys. I yanked the passenger door handle so hard I thought it would break. We dove in, locked the doors, Matt started the engine. The headlights flooded the tree line, and there was nothing there, just trees. Still and silent, he threw it in reverse, spun out onto the road. We didn't speak, not as the trees blurred past, not as the miles stretched behind us, not even when we made it to the main highway, civilization glowing in the distance. We just sat there, breathing, listening, making sure we were still alone. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't want to know. But I do know this. If you ever find yourself in those woods and you hear something moving high up in the trees, don't look up. And whatever you do, don't run. Because if you do, they'll chase you. And next time, they might not let you leave. You ever hear something that doesn't make sense? Like a sound that shouldn't be where it is, shouldn't exist where you are, but it does, and there's no explaining it? That's what happened to me. I was camping alone in the northern Arizona wilderness, out near the Mogollon Rim. I used to love solo camping, just me, a fire, and the silence of the woods. No people, no distractions, no bullshit. I say used to, because after that trip, I haven't been out alone since. It started the first night. I'd hiked about 6 miles from where I parked, deep into the pines. I had a good setup, tent pitched, fire going, a little flask of whiskey to take the edge off the cold. The night was clear, crisp, and completely silent. I mean, dead silent. That's not normal for the woods. Even at night, you hear things, crickets, owls, the distant howls of coyotes. But this was nothing, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I told myself I was being paranoid. The day had been long, I was tired, and silence wasn't a reason to get spooked. So I pushed the thought away, sat back, and enjoyed the fire. Then, somewhere in the dark, I heard whistling. It was faint, distant, a slow, wheezy tune, like someone whistling without really knowing how. I sat up, listening. The sound drifted through the trees, carried by the wind, except there was no wind. The air was completely still. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe some animal made the noise, or maybe it was the whiskey playing tricks on me. So I shook it off and went to bed. But in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I just had this terrible feeling, like my body knew something was wrong before my brain did. Then I heard it again, the whistling. But this time, it was closer, much closer. It wasn't some distant tune carried by the wind anymore. It was right outside my tent. I held my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears. My first thought was that someone had followed me out there. Some drunk, some lunatic, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I reached for my knife, my fingers tight around the handle. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't move, just listened. The whistling circled me, moving slowly, deliberate. It wasn't a song I recognized, just a tuneless, wheezy melody. Like someone was trying to remember a song but kept getting it wrong. I stayed perfectly still, gripping my knife, waiting for whoever, or whatever, was out there to make a move. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited. 5 minutes, 10, nothing. Slowly, I let out the breath I'd been holding. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was some weird bird call. Maybe my tent zipper slid down. From the outside, I didn't think. I lunged forward, knife in hand, and slashed blindly. I heard fabric tear as I burst out of the tent, ready to fight. There was no one there, just my camp. My fire, now smoldering. The trees, dark and motionless, but something was there. Something had been there. Because in the dirt, right outside my tent, were footprints. Bare footprints. I stared at them, my heart pounding. The prints were human, sort of. The toes were too long, the arch too high, and they weren't deep. Whoever, or whatever, had been standing there had been light, too light. Like it wasn't really touching the ground. I packed up and left before the sun even rose. Didn't bother eating breakfast, didn't even put out the fire properly. Just shoved everything into my bag and started hiking. I don't know how far I walked before I heard it again. The whistling, not behind me this time, ahead of me, like it knew where I was going. I didn't stop, didn't think. I just ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, until I could finally see the break in the trees where my truck was parked. And when I did, the whistling stopped, like it had never been there at all. I haven't been back since, and I never will, because some things live in the woods, and some things whistle when they hunt. People always ask me why I don't go hiking alone anymore. I tell them the usual stuff. safety concerns, getting lost, bears. But that's not the real reason. The truth is, I met someone in the woods once, and they weren't supposed to be there. This happened a few years ago in the Smoky Mountains. I'd planned a solo camping trip for the weekend, just me, my tent, and miles of untouched wilderness. I'd always loved the feeling of being alone in nature. No crowds, no noise, just me and the wild. That weekend, the weather was perfect. Cool air, golden autumn leaves crunching beneath my boots. I hiked deep into the forest, following an old, overgrown trail that hardly anyone used anymore. It led to a beautiful, secluded clearing near a creek, the kind of place you don't find on maps. I set up camp, built a fire, and cooked a quick meal as the sun dipped behind the trees. Everything felt peaceful, perfect. Until I heard footsteps. They came from just beyond the fire's glow. Slow, deliberate. Not an animal, too heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. That's when I saw him. A man, standing just at the edge of the clearing. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, dressed in an old flannel shirt and faded jeans. He had a thick beard and this kind of blank expression, like he wasn't expecting to see me there either. We just stared at each other for a second. Then he smiled. "Didn't think anyone else would be out here," he said, stepping closer. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Another hiker, not some creep, just a guy like me, out enjoying nature. I nodded. "Yeah, same. You camping out here too?" He hesitated for just a second before nodding. "Yeah, not far from here." I offered him some food, and he sat down by my fire. He didn't have a pack with him, but I didn't think much of it. We talked for a while, just normal stuff. Hiking, the weather, favorite trails. Something about him was a little off, though. Not in a threatening way, just odd. Like he'd pause for too long before answering a question, or repeat something I'd said earlier in the conversation, like he was trying to keep up. And his smile, it never quite reached his eyes. But I told myself I was overthinking it. He was just a fellow camper, probably lonely and happy to see someone else out here. After an hour or so, he stood up. Well, I should head back to my site before it gets too late. I nodded. "See you in the morning?" He smiled again. "Yeah, see you in the morning." Then he turned and walked back into the woods. I watched him go. He moved weirdly, too smooth, too quiet, like he wasn't stepping on the leaves and twigs at all. But I shook off the unease, put out the fire, and crawled into my tent. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up expecting to hear footsteps outside my tent, but there was nothing, just silence. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my gear and started back toward the main trail. That's when I decided to swing by his campsite, just to say goodbye. But when I got there was nothing. No tent, no fire pit, no footprints. It was like he'd never been there at all. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. Maybe he packed up early? But then why were there no tracks leading away? I walked faster, my skin crawling, suddenly desperate to get back to my car. It took me half the day, but I made it back to the ranger station. I asked them if anyone else had checked in to hike that area. The ranger frowned. "No one's out there but you," he said. "We haven't had anyone take that trail in weeks." I felt sick. I wanted to argue, tell him he was wrong, but I knew what he'd say, because deep down I knew the truth. I don't know who or what I talked to that night, but I do know this. I wasn't alone. And whatever it was, it wanted me to think I was. People think fog is just weather, a natural phenomenon, harmless, even beautiful. But that's because they've never seen what I saw. Because sometimes, when the fog rolls in, something comes with it. It was late October when this happened. My brother Dave and I had planned a camping trip deep in the Pacific Northwest, out near the Olympic National Forest. It was supposed to be one last trip before winter hit, just a quiet weekend in the woods. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, crisp air, not another soul in sight. We found a great spot near a small lake, set up camp, made a fire. That night, we sat by the flames, talking, laughing, completely unaware of what was coming. The next morning, the fog rolled in. I'd seen fog before, sure, but not like this. It was thick, too thick. A heavy, suffocating blanket that swallowed the trees, the ground, even the lake. I couldn't see more than 5 feet in any direction. The air was dead still. No wind, no sound, nothing. And the worst part, it didn't move. Fog usually drifts, shifts, thins out as the sun rises. But this just sat there, hanging in the air like it was alive. I tried to brush it off. "It'll clear up," I told Dave. "We'll just wait it out." But something about it, it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there anymore. By noon, the fog was even thicker. I started getting restless, pacing around camp. That's when I noticed something. The trees, they looked different, like they weren't where they were before. I stared at them, trying to remember. Had that twisted pine always been that close to the fire? Had the big tree with the moss-covered roots always been at that angle? It didn't make sense. I turned to Dave. "Does something seem off to you?" He just shook his head. "Let's just stay put, man. It'll clear." So we waited and waited, and then we heard it. A low, distant sound, somewhere deep in the fog. A groan. Not a human groan. Not an animal either. Something deep, something big. The sound stretched, twisting through the trees, vibrating in my chest, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Dave and I locked eyes. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. He just shook his head. Then it happened again. Closer. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack, my hands suddenly slick with sweat. I didn't know what I thought I was going to do with it, but holding it made me feel less helpless. Dave stood up, scanning the fog. "Maybe it's an elk or something." "Since when do elk sound like that?" We went quiet, listening, then crunch. A footstep, not ours, right behind us. I spun around. Nothing, just white fog, shifting like smoke. Then another crunch, to our left. Then another, in front of us. Slow, heavy, circling us. I gripped the hatchet tighter. "Dave, we need to go, now." But he was already moving. We grabbed our packs, ditching the tent, the fire, everything, and started down the trail. Or at least where the trail was supposed to be. But the trees, they weren't right. They didn't make sense. They were too close together, the trunks twisting in on themselves like they'd grown overnight. "We came this way, right?" Dave muttered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because something was moving in the fog. We didn't see it, not exactly, but we could feel it. A presence. Watching us. Moving when we moved. Stopping when we stopped. And then the groan came again, right behind us. Dave broke. He took off running. I bolted after him, my breath burning, my boots slamming against the dirt. I don't know how long we ran. Time didn't feel real anymore. Nothing did. And then, just like that, the fog was gone. We burst out of it like breaking through a wall, stumbling into the parking lot where our truck was still sitting. The sky was clear. The air was normal. I turned back. The fog was still there. A perfect wall of white right at the tree line, like it was watching us, waiting for us to come back. We never spoke about it after that. We just got in the truck, drove home, and pretended it never happened. But I still wonder, if we hadn't run, if we'd stayed in that fog just a little longer, would we have ever made it out? I grew up in the woods. My dad was a hunter, my grandpa was a hunter, and by the time I was 10, I could tell the difference between a buck and a doe just by the way the brush moved. I knew what a deer looked like, how they acted, how they should act. And that's why when I saw the thing in the trees that night, I knew it wasn't a deer. This happened a few years ago. My buddy Nate and I had planned a short camping trip out in the Tennessee backwoods, deep in the Cherokee National Forest. It was supposed to be a simple trip, hike a few miles, set up camp, drink some beers, and just enjoy the quiet for a couple of days. We got there late in the afternoon, took our time picking a spot, and ended up setting up camp in a clearing not far from a small creek. We gathered some firewood, got a blaze going, and settled in for the night. Everything was fine at first. The air was cool, the fire crackled, and we could hear the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of small animals in the brush. Normal wood sounds. Then, around midnight, the forest went silent. If you've spent enough time outdoors, you know how wrong that is. Even at night, there's always some noise. Crickets, wind, something. But this, nothing. Nate noticed it too. "Feels weird out here, man," he muttered, poking the fire with a stick. I nodded, but before I could say anything, we heard it, a rustling in the trees. Something moving, not fast, not like a coyote darting through the brush, slow, steady, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it toward the sound. And that's when I saw it, a deer. Or at least, it looked like a deer. It stood just beyond the tree line, partially hidden in the shadows. A buck, I thought at first. But something was wrong. Its legs were too long, its body was too thin, its ribs visible beneath patchy, matted fur, and its neck. Jesus, its neck was too damn long. But the worst part, it wasn't moving right. It didn't flick its ears or shift its weight like a normal deer. It just stood there completely still, staring at us. Then it took a step forward, or at least I think it did, because I didn't see it move. It was like 1 second, it was behind the trees, and the next, it was closer. A feeling of pure animal panic crawled up my spine. I've seen some weird shit in the woods before, but this was wrong. I nudged Nate. "Do you see that?" He nodded slowly, eyes locked on the thing in the trees. "That's not a deer, man." The thing took another step, closer. Its head tilted, like it was studying us. Then, in a slow, jerky motion, it stood up. I don't mean it reared onto its hind legs. I mean it stood. Its front legs stretched, its back straightened, its body unfolded into something that was no longer a deer. I don't remember grabbing my knife. I don't remember standing. I just remember Nate whispering, "Run." And we did. We grabbed our packs and bolted, crashing through the trees in the dark, sprinting blindly toward the trail that led back to the car. I don't know if it followed us. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know. By the time we reached the car, we were gasping, shaking, drenched in sweat. We didn't say a word, just threw our shit in the back seat and got the hell out of there. We never went back, and we never talked about it. Because whatever was in those woods that night, it wasn't a deer, and it sure as hell wasn't alone. I don't go camping anymore. Not because I don't love it. I used to. I used to spend every free weekend out in the mountains, just me, a tent, and the quiet of the woods. But after that night, I can't do it, because I don't think I came back alone. This happened about 6 years ago in the Ozarks. I had planned a solo weekend out in one of the more remote areas of the forest. Nothing crazy, just 2 nights alone with my thoughts, a fire, and some good whiskey. The first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I made camp near a small stream, cooked some dinner, and settled in. The stars were bright, and aside from the occasional hoot of an owl, everything felt normal. The second night, that's when it happened. I had been hiking most of the day, exploring some of the smaller, unmarked trails, and by the time I got back to camp, the sun was already setting. I made another fire, ate, and sat back, just enjoying the solitude. Then the feeling hit me. You know that sensation when someone's watching you? That cold, prickling pressure at the back of your neck? I ignored it at first, told myself it was just my imagination. I was alone. I knew I was alone, but the feeling wouldn't go away. And then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep, just beyond the fire's glow. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. Another footstep, slow, heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, no movement, no sound, just the quiet of the woods. But I knew. Something was there. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe. But my gut told me something else. I stayed awake most of the night, sitting by the fire, knife in hand. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, but nothing ever showed itself. By morning, the feeling was gone. I packed up, eager to leave, and started the long hike back to my car. I should have felt better the closer I got to civilization. But the entire way down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was following me. The trees felt wrong, the shadows too deep, the silence too heavy. But every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Still, I practically jogged the last mile to my car, threw my gear in the back seat, and peeled out of there, relief washing over me as I left the forest behind. But that night, at home, as I lay in bed, I heard it, that same heavy, deliberate footstep inside my house. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, listening. Silence. I told myself I imagined it, that I was just overtired, that it was the house settling. But then, something scratched against my bedroom door. Slow, long, like nails, dragging. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The scratching stopped. Then, the door handle turned. I leapt out of bed and threw the door open. Nothing. No one there. But at the far end of the hallway, my front door was wide open. I don't know what followed me home that night, but I do know one thing. I never left the door open. And whatever was in my house, it let itself in. The woods have always held secrets, ancient ones, forgotten ones. And sometimes those secrets slip through the trees, watching, waiting, following. If you made it this far, consider yourself lucky. Not everyone who steps into the deep woods comes back with just a story. Thank you for watching Dark Hours of Day. If you enjoyed these tales of terror, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you have your own chilling experience in the wilderness, let us know in the comments. We might just feature it in a future episode. Until next time, stay out of the dark.